Welcome everyone to this session, and good morning. So today's speaker is Ebrahim Azadegan, who's the chair of the Department of Philosophy of Science at the Sharif University of Tehran. Ebrahim is interested in science, theology, and ethics. And his latest book, titled Human Being and Hidden God, was published in 2019. So today, Ebrahim is going to tell us about divine omnipotence, sexist political order, and Antigone's free action. So thank you very much, Ebrahim, and the floor is yours.
Antigone replied to Creon, "It was not Zeus who made that proclamation to me, nor was it Justice, who resides in the same house with the gods below the earth, who put in place for men such laws as yours. Nor did I think your proclamation so strong that you, a mortal, could overrule the laws of the gods that are unwritten and unfailing. For these laws live not now and yesterday, but always, and no one knows how long ago they appeared. And therefore, I did not intend to pay the penalty among the gods for being frightened of the will of a man." End of quote from Sophocles. Feminists, long-term critic of the traditional concept of omnipotence as a controlling and sovereign God who rules and governs the world from outside, is based on their view that this conception of God legitimizes the submission of women and domination of several forms of religious violence against the other worldviews. According to this line of critique, the belief in God's omnipotence is a belief which has served to bolster the non-egalitarian and sexist political order of our world. There are two available lines of reaction to this feminist attack on the concept of omnipotence: either to accept that the elect problems are inferred from the doctrine of omnipotence, and so we ought to reform the traditional conception of God, or to try to defend the traditional theology's conception of divine attributes and especially omnipotence against these attacks, by arguing that the concept of omnipotence must cohere with the divine mercy, justice, and love, since the bad, degenerate dependence on others such power hides cannot characterize a perfect being. The apparent problem with the former line of thought is to deny power as one of the attributes of a perfect being, and the problem with the latter is that the feminist experience and point of view is not taken seriously, since it still appeals to the conception of omnipotence as the most powerful controller and sovereignty. In this paper, I tried to interpret Sophocles' Antigone as a symbol of feminist movement that challenges any sexist, racist, paternalist political order by bringing into attention God's law of mercy. My interpretation, nevertheless, seems to be in contrast with Hegel's and Judith Butler's readings. In order to explicate my reading, a new conception of power that comes from God's sense as love and mercy, which can be the source of divine love, has been introduced, a law that intertwines with feminist political order. According to this reading of the play, the sexist political order is in conflict with God's law of kinship and love as the natural feeling which binds family members through an original blood tie, which will eventually and fatefully diminish that order. This challenge seems to me to be the deep root of this tragedy, the Sophocles tragedy. However, a non-sexist feminist political order can be established in harmony with God's law of love. In other words, while there is a serious conflict between God's law of sovereignty and non-sexist political order, The sexist political order can find support from traditional conception of omnipotence. Of course, God's omnipotence does not directly translate into sexist political order. One might argue, since only God is the all-powerful, then all human beings do not have any power and therefore cannot experience power over each other. All power is God's. However, this argument seems a red herring, since the social order in our religious societies is based on and constituted by our religious doubts, as I shall elaborate it in due course. And since the social order is a hierarchy of power, the concept of religious power is essential to the construction of the social order. The conception of God as the controller and sovereign will definitely introduce to the hierarchy of our patriarchal social order. I shall conclude that Antigone's feminist action is the only way to destabilize the order of society, which is continuing to live in a sexist order, believing in a God who is the sovereign ruler of the world and acts irresponsibly for any of his actions. But in our religious societies, Antigone's action could be constructive only if we changed already our views regarding God's attributes and loves. Two conceptions of omnipotence. Traditional theology describes God as the most perfect being, who has all the good attributes and is the ultimate reality. God, as the ground of being, is the good, is capital G. Since all beings are dependent existentially on God, he is the sovereign and controller of their existence. And since God is the good, he has planned and desired a wise providence for all beings. So God is omnipotent in two senses. In one sense, the existence of all beings is in the hands of God and dependent on his existence. And so he has all the power to rule over them and control them. In another sense, God is the perfect person who acts upon his free will to reach the good and the rational telos according to his providential plan, and there is nothing that could prevent God from performing his actions. These two conceptions of omnipotence are deeply irreconcilable. The former conception implies that God, as the sovereign power of the world, edicts the laws that constitute the order of the world, and as the sustainer of the law and the order, he punishes the transgressors. He only admits and desires obedience of the unchangeable and eternal laws by his servants. He is the dominant king and the master of the universe. However, the latter conception of omnipotence is deeply in contrast with the former. According to this conception, God's power to act toward his purposes springs from and is rooted in his love, mercy, wisdom, goodness, and rationality. Here, omnipotence is not to be only reconciled with divine mercy and love, but his power is nothing more and above his love and mercy. Divine simplicity thesis requires that all of these attributes are the same, and so it is his love and goodness alongside his wisdom and rationality that guide his power, and hence the order of the world is based on laws which are grounded in love and mercy. According to this conception, God's power is rooted in God's goodness and defined by his wise actions toward the good telos, but while in the former conception, God's power could be limited only by the rules of logic and divine wisdom. The power means to get free the creatures to become your lovers freely. This is the meaning of power. So the God is the most powerful and the lover and creator of the human beings as free creatures capable of coming to love relationship with him. Clark Pinnock, in a subtle manner, explains the difference between these two conceptions of God's power from open theism point of view. Quote from Pinnock. We must not define omnipotence as the power to determine everything, but rather as the power that enables God to deal with any situation that arises. Plainly, God is not at the moment all in all. This has yet to happen when the kingdom comes. God's power presently is more subtle, much greater, in fact, than the coercive power of a puppeteer. Monopoly power is easy to manage. More difficult is the power that makes free agents and governs a universe where creatures can disobey. Omnipotence does not mean that nothing can go contrary to God's will, but that God is able to deal with any circumstance that may arise. Love rather than almighty power is the primary perfection of God. When love says that power will not work in a situation, power is allowed to withdraw in favor of powerlessness. God does not overcome his enemies by forcing, but by loving them. God works not in order to subject our wills, but to transform our hearts. Love and not sheer power overcomes evil. God does not go in for power tactics. Here Pinnock illustrates the two conceptions of divine omnipotence based on two conceptions of power, namely the power to control and the power to bestow freedom. According to open theism, God is omnipotent in a sense that bestows freedom to creatures and risks limiting his power by letting the creatures to decide freely. God permits us to deny his laws, to rebel against his desired plan, and he then opens the way for us to return and repent. The question then is, which conception of God as omnipotent is praiseworthy? The God who is sovereign and controls everything eternally from a vantage point aloof and out of time, or a God who lets us and all other creatures to freely choose our ways of life according to our capabilities to act freely, and then invites them to be covenant partners and opens for them the possibility of love relationship with him. According to the latter conception, the omnipotence God is the guardian of love, freedom, and mercy. It is noteworthy that when I talk about these two conceptions of omnipotence and perfectness, the meaning of power as freedom bestowing rather than controlling, I do not want to deny that God as omnipotent has sovereignty and control over everything, but to emphasize how we should prioritize between these two conceptions in order to achieve a better view of God. So to interpret the attribute of omnipotence, we ought to see it through the eyes of perfect being theology and to prioritize between two contrast conceptions, both of which are attributed to God. My suggestion is to see God's power within the boundary of his mercy and wisdom. Nevertheless, each of these theological viewpoints has its own social and political consequences. I shall illustrate this in the next section. Theology matters. Theology matters not only because religious beliefs are ubiquitous in human history and societies from prehistoric to modern days, but as Carol Christ emphasizes, it also provides orientation for social, political, and ethical decision making. In the background of the political laws of all modern societies, we can find traces of religious norms and thoughts, which have consciously or unconsciously penetrated into the constitutions. Still, most of us live in societies in which religious laws and institutions fundamentally inspire or shape or identify our socio-political intra and interrelations. To find meaning for our lives, to pray during our pains and sufferings, or even to deny these and try to be independent free agents, we engage or struggle with divinity. As Christ says, Carol Christ, quote, without new theological language, we are likely to be hesitant, reluctant, or unable to speak about the divinity we struggle with, reject, call upon in times of need, or experience in daily life. Yet, ideas about the sacred are one of the ways we orient ourselves in the world, express the values we consider most important, and envision the kind of world we would like to bring into being. Our ideas about divinity are also intimately connected to questions that trouble us in the night about whether life has purpose and what that purpose might be. End of quote from Chris. Religion significantly engages in such questions, and many of its answers, whether satisfactory or not, are the initial object of our thoughts about human nature, human destiny, and purpose of life. Furthermore, what is important for our discussion is the role of religion in providing norms and laws upon which our socio-political order has been constituted. Alfred Radcliffe Brown, the famous British anthropologist, explains how religion can provide a function of an orderly social life. He suggests a general formula that religion essentially includes rites and ceremonies that are the bond that holds the multitudes together and helps develop in mankind what may be called a sense of dependence. Quote from Radcliffe Brown. My suggestion is that in attempting to understand a religion, it is on the rites rather than on the beliefs that we should first concentrate our attention. Then the theory is that an orderly social life amongst human beings depends upon the presence in the minds of the members of a society of certain sentiments, which control the behavior of the individual in his relation to others. Rights can be seen to be the regulated symbolic expressions of certain sentiments. Rights can therefore be shown to have a specific social function when and to the extent that they have further effort to regulate, maintain, and transmit from one generation to another sentiment on which the constitution of the society depends. The rights gave regulated expression to certain human feelings and sentiments and to keep these sentiments alive and active. In turn, it was these sentiments which, by their control or influence on the conduct of individuals, made possible the existence and continuance of an orderly social life. End of quote. So Radcliffe Brown suggests that our social life has been constituted by common sentiments that make us dependent on one another. This social dependence can provide a foundation for socio-political order. But studying several different religions, from Australian totemism to ancient Asian ancestor worship to higher order religions such as Christianity or Islam, he concludes that in all of them there is a close correspondence of the form of religion and that of the social structure. A religion that introduces a god or deity who is supporter of family and love relationships and is the most merciful and freedom bestowing person is a religion that emphasizes the love of kinship over the love of sovereign king. And after becoming integrated in the society, extends the love of kinship to the society. From these, all the institutional laws and political laws come out based on sympathetic friendship and fellowship. On the other hand, a religion that supports a paternal authoritarian god or deity who is the most dominant and powerful sovereign in the sense of controller and determiner of all the past and future events leads to totalitarian states that observe and control the society altogether and to a patriarchal society which worships absolute power. One might think that the notion of God as sovereign authority does not license by its own internal logic the existence of evil power. But as we have already experienced now, while the logic of omnipotence as the sovereign almighty may not permit evil exercise of power, still such a theological viewpoint would lean to legitimate construction of the patriarchal and totalitarian political state. This kind of theology that attaches perfection and goodness to the totalitarian power of the Almighty includes the belief that the totalitarian state is the form of a state which is similar to divine sovereignty in terms of excellence. Of course, theologians might argue that although a powerful ruler bears some degree of excellence as compared to that of God, however, since God's attribute of power includes other elements such as beneficence, mercy, and rationality, then the dictator like Hitler or his nowadays fellows lacks the sort of true excellence to be godlike. We can accept this apology, but not all sorts of totalitarian systems are as blatantly evil as Nazis. There are implicit sorts of paternalist systems, which, under the guise of social security or preventing the society from falling evil cultures, or saving families against feminism's supposedly devastating attacks, try to retain their hierarchical sexist or racist sociopolitical structure, alluding to divine law and theological viewpoints as its foundation. Nevertheless, it seems that the conception of divine as the guardian of the law of love, mercy, friendly relations, family, and kinship is what Antigone entertains when she refers to divine law as the laws of gods that are unwritten and unfailing. For these laws are the fundamental rules based on which family relationships and consequently the whole of society would be constructed. Family is the constitutive element of the society. And so destroying the family by ignoring its fundamental laws will definitely lead to the deconstruction of the entire society. So the family laws are unfailing, but we should distinguish between this fundamental role of family law of kinship in construction of the society and the destructive role of family nepotism. Antigone's action is to publicize and universalize the kinship relationship in order to save the society from disobeying the divine rule. She publicizes brotherhood. For her, there is no difference between each of his brothers, and everybody killed in the bilateral war, as she says, and now what is this proclamation they say the general has issued for all the citizens, demand. Have you heard anything? Or have you not noticed that evils of our enemies are marching now against our friends and dear ones? End of quote. In other words, through her action, she tries to demonstrate that the social rules have to desert family rules, and through which the family rules of love will be publicized to the extent that everybody in the society will be treated as my family members. By nepotism, in contrast, one particularizes the social rules and use the social relations in order to benefit the family relations. Nepotism particularizes the public, but Antigone publicizes the private. So in my reading, her feminist movement is not a kind of nepotism. The family rules are also unwritten. They are not authored by human beings and are essential to the human condition based on their social nature. An example of a written law is Creon's law as the ruler of the city. But divine law can be in serious conflict with the king's proclaimed and written laws of the city, which Crown recognizes himself as their guardian. Crown declares this conflict when he says, quote, I'll kill her. Of that, let her sing her hymns in praise of Zeus, the god of bounds of blood. End of quote. Of course, this internal conflict between divine law and human law leads definitely to a tragic and devastating situation. To choose another conception of divine law which matches the king's law is a more desirable way for totalitarian states. Paternalism in society and family can make a coherent socio-political order and last for a long time. In Hegel's interpretation of Antigone, divine law is in conflict with human law, or the law as the manifest ethical power of the state. This conflict is represented in the conflict between family and police, particular and universal, and the conflict between woman and man. Nature, according to Hegel, assigns woman to divine law and man to human law. The family, quote from Hegel, as the element of the nation's actual existence, stands opposed to the nation itself, and woman, as the individual being for self, is opposed to man as order which shapes and maintains itself by working for the universal. End of quote from Hegel. So, the political life of the city-state is the realm of man to manifest himself in the community, while family is the sphere of womanhood. In order to perform their natural and teleological role, a man breaks up the limitation of the family laws and goes beyond the family sphere to reach human law and universal ethical sphere, and the woman remains the head of household and the guardian of the divine law. Quote from Hegel. In this way, the two sexes overcome their merely natural being and appear in their ethical significance as diverse beings who share between them and the two distinctions belonging to the ethical substance. End of quote from Hegel. However, the community which is ideally established on the basis of rational universal law of ethics as the human law is internally in conflict with the family law while it is essentially dependent on family to be constituted. This conflict, according to Hegel, is devastating for society, and for him, Antigone is the prototype of a woman whose act destroys the entire society. In addition to that, according to Hegel, Antigone's deed is criminal, since he thinks that Antigone's deed is stubbornly done in contrast with the law of the society, which consequently in this way turns to ridicule the earnest wisdom of mature age which, indifferent to purely private pleasures and enjoyments, as well as to playing an active part, only thinks of and cares for the universal. Hegel says that she makes this wisdom an object of derision for raw and irresponsible youth and unworthy of their enthusiasm. End of quote from Hegel. In other words, in the clash between the divine and human law, Hegel sides with human law, since it is the law for the inhabitants of the earth, while the divine law is for the onward. However, Hegel's view toward Antigone's actions seems misleading. While it is true that in a society where the divine law of family and kinship is in conflict with the human law of state authority, Antigone's action is destructive. However, it is not at all criminal. I read Antigone's action as a destabilizing action toward building a society in which ultimately the divine law of love, friendship, and mercy becomes the law of society. Human law, instead of being built on authoritarian law, is to be constructed upon the law of care. As Patricia Mills says, quote, Hegel misses what is most significant, that Antigone must enter the political realm, the realm of second nature, in order to defy it on behalf of the realm of the family, the realm of the first nature. In doing this, Antigone transcends Hegel's analysis of the law of woman as natural ethical life and becomes this particular self. Sophocles presents a situation in which Antigone must reconcile her obligations to the family and its gods with the demands of the political sphere represented by Creon. End of quote from Mills. Antigone's action is destructive, okay, but this destruction is towards constructing a new socio-political order in accordance with private and family order. She defies Creon, and in so doing brings divine law into the human community in opposition to the authority of the polis. What is seriously missing in Hegel's account is that he does not pay enough attention to the unjust patriarchal order of the society in which Antigone lives. Unlike her sister Ismene, who accepts her womanhood in such a society as the subordinate and second gender, Antigone tries to deconstruct such an unjust and unsacred political order and to reconstruct a new order based on human values, regardless of their deeds. Both of her brothers, regardless of their deeds, deserve to be honored as human beings. Antigone acts in order to protect the laws of family. She must act in spite of the coerced public inaction. Antigone tries to publicize her act in order to be heard against Creon's unjust edict. Ismene counsels her, quote, tell no one of this act beforehand. But Antigone responds, oh, tell them all. I shall hate you far more if you remain silent and do not proclaim this to all. Hegel also does not consider that Creon's behavior in dishonoring and disvaluing a human being is unjust. As Mills says, Hegel's interpretation of Creon as the just representative of the law of the polis is as radical a departure from Sophocles' tragedy as is his portrayal of Antigone. The conflict between the just moral law and the unjust political law, which is central to Sophocles' Antigone, is muted in Hegel's interpretation. Antigone's deed against the unjust patriarchal socio-political order is interpreted by Judith Butler as another way of using the language of sovereignty toward reaching political power. Judith Butler says that, quote, Antigone's language is not that of a survival political agency. Her words, understood as deeds, are chiasmically related to the vernacular of sovereign power, speaking in and against it, delivering and defying imperatives at the same time, inhabiting the language of sovereignty at the very moment in which she opposes sovereign power and is excluded from its terms. What this suggests is that she cannot make her claim outside the language of the state, but neither can the claim she wants to make be fully assimilated by the state. End of quote. Butler's idea is that Antigone's action is a manly action toward approaching authority against the authority of Creon and in defiance of the law through the voice of the law. So she plays in the game of sovereignty and power gaining. Butler confirms that she not only does the deed, refusing to obey the edict, but she also does it again by refusing to deny that she has done it. thus appropriating the rhetoric of agency from Crown himself. Her agency emerged precisely through her refusal to honor his command, and yet the language of this refusal assimilates the very terms of sovereignty that she refuses. End of quote. Butler is right in saying that Antigone is trying to overthrow Crown's authoritarian system through her defiance and rebellion. However, Antigone's action is not at all authoritarian toward the establishment of another authority, like the action of his dead brother Polynices. Since, as mentioned above, for Antigone both her brothers deserve a funeral, but hasn't Crown honored only one of our two brothers with a tomb and dishonored the other? Antigone says. Contra Butler, I think Antigone's action is a destabilizing action rather than an authority-seeking one. She called upon superseded, oppressed, silenced, and forgotten divine values of love, kinship, and friendship. She never claims to be the ruler of the city in place of Crown. It was Crown who thought that Antigone as a woman has no right to rule, and he would never let a woman rule as long as he lives. Crown says that a filthy way to think submitting to a woman. But Antigone does not mind this type of governance at all. She seeks a new social order in which the family and divine law exist in harmony with the state rules and laws. Hegel also sees Antigone's action as an action that transgresses the rule Antigone as a woman has to be engaged in. So the fate of a woman in that word is to be like Ismen, to live under submission of man, or to die like Antigone because of transgressing the law. Hegel as always tries to find a way out of this tragic dilemma. He admits that the unity or identity in difference between the human law and divine law can be acquired, but only when the divine law is not a law of family and kinship. For him, just as the universal truth, which was revealed by the divine light, has here withdrawn into the inner or nether world of being, and is thus freed from the form of contingent existence, then the divine law can become a universal law of essential being, which does not have the form of contingent existence to an alien speech, knows it as the sure and unwritten law of the gods, a law that is everlasting and no one knows whence it came. Hegel thinks that a stable socio-political order in which the divine law and the human law reconcile with each other can only be established in a world where the divine law, as Hegel describes, is not a particularistic family law. But Hegel sees only one sort of reconciliation. Conclusion. To reach the feminist, non-sexist, non-racist social order, we ought to first re-examine and privatize our human laws, and second, reform our theological viewpoints toward the divine attribute of omnipotence. My suggestion is that it is possible to establish a stable socio-political order in which the divine law and human law are reconciled and unified. However, the human law of the polis has to be constructed upon a constitution whose highest value is social responsibility and friendly relationships. In this new socio-political order, God exists not as totalitarian sovereign, but as a merciful sustainer of creatures' freedom. In such a world, the great philosophers will positively read Antigone's action as inspiring instead of criminal. Thank you very much for your attention.